It can be particularly challenging to ensure the fairness of artificial intelligence models due to the variety of contexts that they are deployed in and due to the varying definitions of fairness. Today, we'll be talking with Caleb Barr, who is a researcher studying fairness in AI models. Welcome to the podcast, Caleb.
Hi, Luke. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So at a high level, what was the main purpose of your paper and what are its main contributions?
Okay, well, AI use has grown rapidly in the last couple of years, and with that, so has opportunities for misuse, particularly around fairness concerns. And so what my research paper was a review of all the literature surrounding fairness and machine learning and coming up with a method to define the appropriate measures of fairness for use across all machine learning and AI contexts.
Perfect. And so what university degree do you have or are you currently pursuing?
So I'm currently pursuing a PhD in mechanical engineering at the University of Canterbury here in New Zealand. However, my research more lies in the data science philosophy framework. And so, yes, which is slightly different to your usual AI scientist.
Yeah. And how did you get into this type of work?
So my research is on predicting the risk of prisoners reoffending using machine learning. And with that, we are looking at whether these models are fair in predictive power between race and gender. And so this led me to the question of what is a fair machine learning model and what is fairness? And that's how I got involved into this research.
And did you present this paper at a conference?
No, I have not, but this paper is currently available as a preprint online, and we are in the process of submitting it to a journal.
Very interesting. Great. So let's get into some questions about the paper. What are some areas of high stakes decision making where fairness takes the forefront?
So the most prominent example of unfairness in machine learning would have been the compass example. So in 2016, ProPublica published a report on compass. So compass is the reoffending prediction tool used in parts of the United States. So when prisoners are released, they're given a risk score based on this compass model that determines things like parole and rehabilitation. And what they found was that African American offenders were twice as likely as white offenders to be labeled high risk, yet not go on to reoffend, and white offenders were twice as likely to be labeled low risk and go on to reoffend. And so this really proliferated all the modern research in fair AI. And there have been further examples as well. There's plenty more. Amazon, you for a while used an AI recruitment tool that was more likely to hire male employees than females, and that was because it was based on historical data where they previously were more likely to hire male employees. And more recently, with generative AI models, things like DALL-E, which is an image generator, is more likely to show white people in certain occupations. And so there's lots of potentials for harm in modern AI models with regards to fairness.
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like some of these models can be unfair to certain races or groups of people when predicting reoffending crimes, or when making hiring decisions, or making generating pictures. And so it's really important that these types of mistakes with the machine learning models can be very harmful to society. So
yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Very interesting. And what is the EU AI Act, and what are some of its shortcomings?
So the EU AI Act was developed through the increased use of AI in modern technologies, and with that, there's been concern that it's unregulated. So what the EU AI Act requires is safety, transparency, traceability, non-discrimination, and environmental friendliness. So the part of the EU AI Act I'm concerned about is non-discrimination. However, the EU AI Act does not provide specific definitions of what bias and fairness is in AI. And so if anyone was looking to, from a regulatory framework of how to, or I guess, regulate AI models, there would be no precise definitions of what an unfair model is. Although I do want to point out that this is a good thing in a way because of the complexities of defining fairness in AI. You can't have a one-size-fits-all model. And so by not defining precisely what unfairness is, the EU AI Act won't lead to unintended consequences.
Interesting. And on the international level, what are the most authoritative standards in the AI field?
So the ISO Standard Committee would be the most authoritative. So they've been rapidly trying to develop standards around fair AI. However, it is a bit of a moving target because as AI is developing so rapidly, so are concerns around fairness. So currently, the ISO standards only define biases in AI and where these biases come from and how they can affect unfairness or affect fairness in these models. And so they haven't provided any quantitative measures of fairness as of yet.
Great. So yeah, let's go into some of the questions about bias. So how do you define bias and fairness, and what is the relationship between them?
So the ISO committee defines bias as the systematic difference in the treatment of certain objects, people, or groups in comparison to others. And so what that is, well, it's as it says, just the difference in treatment of groups. However, with biases in AI, there's wanted biases and there's unwanted biases. So for example, coming from my background on predicting prisoner reoffending, you do want some form of wanted bias. You want there to be a difference in how the data perceives reoffenders to non-reoffenders. And so you want a bias in that regards to make prediction. The unwanted biases are when there are causal effects on how, say, gender is predicted or ethnicity is predicted in these data sets. And so fairness is essentially the effect of unwanted biases on AI models. So fairness is defined as a treatment, behavior, or outcome that respects established facts, beliefs, and norms, and is not determined by favoritism or unjust discrimination. So essentially, the ISO committee provides this sort of word soup of what fairness is without sort of providing a single quantitative definition of fairness. And again, this is to stop the effects of the sort of complexities of defining fairness and the effects of a single definition would have on regulation.
Okay, and just to be clear, so for the bias part of it, that the idea is that there's wanted bias and unwanted bias, and so the idea of bias is that you can distinguish between two different types of things. And so So then there can be the wanted bias where you are distinguishing between predicting positive or negative in your data set, but then you have the unwanted bias where that prediction is happening as a result of some type of trait or characteristic such as race or gender, which you don't want to be included in the predictions.
Yeah, it's some form of proxy, and where you've got input variables that also are proxy variables for race or gender or different forms of discriminated groups.
I see. That makes sense. And so what are the 3 types of biases?
So in academia, in the machine learning field, we define bias in a bias interaction loop. So you have data biases, and they have an effect on algorithm biases, which have an effect on user interaction biases, which then goes on to affect your data set. And so it can be a sort of a positive reinforcement model where biases propagate in a system. And our paper provides novelty in this by saying that context is a driver of these biases.
Interesting. And what is the most common type of bias?
So the most common type of bias would be data bias. And this is because most decisions in a AI model are made around the data set. So when you're developing models, you have to decide what the data set is, and from there it can lead to erroneous representations of certain groups. You can have missing data, or even just what information your data contains if there's proxies. And like I said, before that, proxies can represent be representative of groups of protected groups such as gender and race and what have you. And there can be causal relations from that to what you're actually wanting to predict.
And can you discuss the main types of data bias?
So the most common types of data bias would be sampling bias, where you've got a underrepresentation of your population. So in that, as I was talking about the Amazon recruitment tool, their data set used historical data, which historically there were more males were hired by Amazon than females. And so the data set was not representative of the population of employees they were looking to employ. You also have missing data bias. And so there's research suggests that members of protected or discriminated groups are more likely to have missing data. And so that affects models in the long run, where these groups, discriminated groups with missing data, are less predictive because of the missing data.
That makes sense. And what are the different types of user interaction bias?
So user interaction biases are interesting because there's evidence to suggest that AI bias reinforces cognitive biases in humans. And so really the onus is on how the model is used by developers and how these biases can play a part. So one important type of user interaction bias is historical bias. And so historically disadvantaged groups in the reoffending realm, which I'm going to come back to lots throughout this talk, is that historically disadvantaged groups can be arrested at higher rates. In recidivism prediction models, this could lead to an overestimation of offending risk in the disadvantaged group, and can therefore you can have increased surveillance on these minority groups and further which would lead to further reconviction and therefore propagating these historical biases. So like I was saying before, it's a bit of a positive reinforcement loop.
I see. And what are some methods to reduce bias from entering an AI system?
So, in the whole fair AI field, some researchers try to manipulate the AI models themselves to generate fairer outcomes. However, my opinion, personal opinion, is that eliminating these biases in the first place is more important. And so biases such as missing data bias, you can use methods such as imputation of mean for quantitative measures or mode for qualitative measures, as those have been shown to be better than deletion in terms of fairness. There's also things such as avoiding the use of geographically narrow data sets to maintain a good representation of what the end users are, as well as avoiding exclusion of underrepresented populations just because they are underrepresented, because any representation of minority groups is important for fairness, even if it is underrepresented.
I see. Great. So let's move into talking about fairness. What are the two notions of fairness that govern the US legal framework?
So the US dominates the fair AI research field. And so we do look to the US a lot for guidance on defining fairness. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act in the US defined two notions of fairness. The first one is disparate treatment. And so disparate treatment is defined as the differential treatment of individuals based on their group membership. The other notion of fairness is disparate impact, which is defined as how neutral policy negatively affects members of one group more than another. And so when you put these two notions of fairness against each other, they both can't be simultaneously satisfied. For example, if you consider gender in a reoffending model, and this could be classified as disparate treatment because you're considering individuals based on their group membership. However, if you ignore gender in a reoffending model, then this could be considered as disparate impact because the neutral policy of not considering gender will affect females more because females reoffend at a lower rate. And so you're treating males and females to be the same, whereas females are less likely to reoffend.
Interesting. So it's a complicated issue then.
Exactly. Yeah.
What are some of the most popular definitions of fairness that are currently in use?
So our review paper carried out a systematic review of this question, and we found the three most popular measures of fairness. The first one is equal opportunity. And so that is when your two groups, say if you're taking males and females, they have the same true positive rate. The second measure of fairness is statistical parity, where you want the number of positive predictions to be the same. So for example, if you were using AI models for hiring, you might want the numbers of male and female, or the rate of male and female applicants, the same rate to be hired. And so, the third measure of fairness would be equalized odds, where you want equal rates of false positives and false negatives.
Can you explain the debate around using causal metrics for fairness?
So there's two common families of fairness measures. You have observational fairness measures and causal fairness measures. And so observational fairness considers only the data and assesses statistical relationships between variables. And this is historically what we've used in the fair AI field. More recently, we've developed causal fairness measures. And so they consider the broader context, such as how the data is generated and how variables are selected to affect model behavior. And so the pros for causal measures is that you can understand the entire context of the data and how the model is formed before making conclusions. However, obtaining the correct causal models are quite challenging, and they can be quite difficult to be employed in practice. I believe an appropriate assessment of fairness considers both causal fairness and observational fairness.
I see. That makes sense. And why is it so hard to measure fairness?
Well, philosophically, there's many different ways of measuring fairness. People from different cultures and backgrounds will have different ideas of what fair is. And then mathematically, this challenge becomes more complex. You have problems. The main problem with measuring fairness is that many of these measures contradict each other. As I talked about with disparate impact and disparate treatment in the US legal framework, how they contradict each other, mathematically it's the same. You'll have one model that will make an assessment that an AI model is fair, and one definition that will say it's unfair, and they can't coexist. And this is really the crux of my research, where we talk about how to appropriately pick a fairness definition for the context of your model.
Interesting. What inspired you to create a flowchart for context-appropriate fairness measures, and how does this flowchart work?
So what I've realized is there's no logical or scientific way of assessing fairness in AI models. And it occurred to me that really context is the main driver of providing rigorous definitions of fairness. And a big inspiration to me was the research by Mark Luth, who was the first person I saw to develop sort of a similar flowchart to me in terms of picking appropriate measures of fairness. So my flowchart is based on 12 different criteria, and these provide these are really based on how biases inform unfairness in a model. And so the way the flowchart works is a user who wants to assess fairness in their machine learning model will go through the flowchart, and with the context of their model, they'll be able to pick an appropriate measure of fairness for their model. And what I believe is that this is just a small part of assessing fairness in machine learning models. I think our flowchart can be used to define fairness in terms of how models are fair with respect to data, but you've then got causal measures of fairness, which can provide an understanding of whether your data is fair with respect to the real world. And then you also need to take into account how your model is used. So if your models can be misused even if they provide fair outcomes. And so this is all sort of a three-part approach to assessing fairness in AI models.
What are some caveats of the observational fairness selection method?
So we take a Western point of view for our fairness selection model. And so, like I was saying, fairness is sort of personal to every culture and ethical ideas and people's values. And so I think it provides a good start for assessing fairness, but there is room for improvement. But I think it provides a good start.
That makes sense. After assessing fairness in an AI model, one might want to improve the fairness in the model. What is the fairness accuracy trade-off?
Yes, so there's many methods of improving fairness in AI models. Obviously, my research looks at defining fairness. And once you've got an idea of how fair your model is, you can use either pre-processing, in-processing, or post-processing methods to improve fairness in your models. However, what you'll find is as fairness improves, accuracy of your model decreases. And so this is our fairness accuracy trade-off. And that's why I believe that properly improving fairness in your models should come from removing biases from the beginning, as opposed to just ad hoc improvements of fairness of your model.
That makes sense. So let's go into some finishing questions about your
Mhm.
PhD work. What do you do for your PhD work?
So, like I was saying, my PhD is on predicting prisoner recidivism using machine learning and taking an approach of assessing these models for fairness and predictive power between race and gender.
And how do you define fairness in recidivism prediction models?
So we have two, my take on it is there's two appropriate measures for measuring fairness with respect to the data. And so these measures are called balance group area under the curve and also calibration. And so balance group area under the curve essentially says that accuracy of both models should be similar. And calibration says offenders who are low risk should have a low risk of reoffending. Offenders who are classified as medium risk should have a medium risk, and offenders who are classified as high risk should have a high risk of reoffending. However, there should also be, when assessing fairness and recidivism models, you should also have an understanding of the causal representation of the data. And so, I mean, it's well known that minorities are policed differently, and perhaps criminal justice outcomes will be different to majority groups. And so you should, when defining these fairness measures, you should pay respect to how this causal, or you should pay respect to how this treatment could be different for different groups.
I see. Great. That's all the questions that I have. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It was really great talking to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. It was a pleasure to be here.